In wars throughout history, people expect death to arrive wearing a soldier uniform, holding weapons, and marching with loud fury, yet in the occupied streets of Harlem during the year 1943. Death sometimes moved on two thin wheels and wore the face of a child who should have still been learning how to live instead of learning how to kill, and that child was a 14-year-old girl who rode her bicycle through the afternoon roads with her hair in two neat braids that swung softly against her shoulders as she pedaled with steady rhythm, and every German guard at every checkpoint treated her like she was nothing more than a harmless student running chores for her family, and they waved her through without the smallest bit of suspicion, because to their eyes she was too young, too innocent, too unimportant to be a threat. Yet this small mistake was the opening that would cost several Nazi officers their lives, for hidden beneath an old cloth inside the basket on her handlebars rested a fully loaded FN Browning pistol, and the girl steering that bicycle knew exactly when and how she would need to use it, for her name was Freddie Oversteegen, and she was not riding home for play. She was moving through enemy territory like a ghost with a purpose, because she was part of the Dutch resistance, and the battles she fought were not the battles of tanks or aircraft, but the battles of disguised deception and a kind of courage that came from pure necessity. Rather, that glory in her story could never be softened into a fairy tale, for it was shaped by harsh reality and blood-stained choices. Long before she ever held a weapon for survival, Freddie had been shaped by hunger, and by hardship that forged her spine into steel. She had been born in the month of September, the year 1925, in a small village named Schoten near Haarlem, but she did not grow up in the pretty postcard version of the Netherlands that modern visitors imagine. Instead, she grew up inside the hard life of a poor family who lived on a barge drifting on the canals, where the smell of cold, damp air and stale water filled every corner of their floating home. And her father was a gentle dreamer who loved to sing songs in French, yet he could never earn enough to support the family in the way they desperately needed, so the strength in the household came from her mother Traint Oversteegen, who was a woman carved from stone by the hardship around her, and she openly embraced communist beliefs during years when such views already placed a mark on your back. Yet for her these ideas were not academic debates, they were fuel for action, and she used her beliefs to guide daughters to help people instead of watching them suffer, and the girls learned compassion by witnessing refugees from Lithuania hide in the dark hold of their barge, while their mother gave them shelter without hesitation. And through this they learned their first truth, that when human lives are in danger you do not look away, you step forward, even if the cost is heavy. When the marriage collapsed, the family had to leave the barge and settle in a cramped apartment in Haarlem, where poverty hit even harder, and the children slept on straw beds and wore second-hand clothing, yet their mother refused to let hardship crush their dignity. She kept them active inside the Dutch Youth Federation, where instead of toys they crafted dolls for children orphaned by the Spanish Civil War. And little by little, the sisters came to understand that the world beyond their doors was turning darker as fascist rulers rose and refugees fled burning nations, until the nightmare finally reached them on the 10th day of May in the year 1940. When the German war machine stormed into the Netherlands with brutal speed and crushed Dutch resistance, within 5 days forcing the Queen to flee, while Rotterdam burned under Luftwaffe bombing that shook the nation into helpless surrender. And in the following days, Haarlem changed overnight as swastikas appeared on buildings, and German boots hammered the cobblestones with their new oppressive authority, while most civilians tried to hide their fear and keep their heads down and hoped the British or the Americans would one day return to push the invaders out. Yet the Oversteegen home did not wait for rescue, because waiting felt like surrender, and the family began to resist almost immediately, starting not with weapons but with paper, as they printed illegal leaflets in their living room using a noisy press that shook the walls and required watchers at the street corners. And at night Freddie, then only 14, and her older sister Truus, who was 16, carried pots of glue and stacks of posters, and they moved quietly through the dark, pasting warnings over Nazi propaganda that urged Dutch workers to travel to Germany for labor. And their posters declared that for every Dutch worker sent to Germany, a German soldier would be freed to fight on the front lines. And though this was incredibly risky, the invaders dismissed these acts as childish mischief because they believed true danger could only come from grown men. But their blindness would soon break, for in the year 1941, a man named Frans van der Wiel, leader of the Haarlem resistance, stepped into their doorway and asked not for flyers but for fighters, and he looked into the eyes of these two teenage girls, and asked them if they were willing to learn how to use weapons, and in that quiet apartment childhood ended forever, and the war reached into their lives and claimed them. The air inside the small living room felt heavier once Franz asked that question, for it was not the kind of question children should ever hear, yet these girls were no longer allowed to be children, and the silence that followed stretched like a blade across the floor, because everyone understood the weight of what he was truly asking, since taking up weapons meant treason, and treason under occupation meant certain execution, and Truze, being the older sister, found the strength to speak, first asking the thing that hung over all of them like a shadow, whether they would have to end lives with their own hands. And Franz did not offer comfort or soft illusions, for he knew that lying to them would be crueler than the truth. So he answered plainly and told them yes, but only the men who hunted Jews and tortured innocents and betrayed their own neighbors to earn German favor. And he explained that this war could not be won with posters alone, and that sometimes survival required acts that no one should have to perform, yet still someone must do them. And the girls turned to their mother, because this was a decision too large for them alone. And Trench looked at her daughters with love and fear and pride tangled together, and she understood that saying no might protect their bodies for a moment, but it would crush their spirits because they had already chosen to resist. And she had raised them to act when injustice rose like a storm, so she gave her blessing, but with one rule she demanded. They never forget, always stay human, she said, keep your soul. Even when the world tries to rip it away, it was a noble rule, yet war often takes noble ideas and shatters them, and Freddie would one day carry the weight of that rule like a stone that never left her chest, because she would learn that staying human in a world filled with cruelty was far harder than pulling a trigger. After the decision was made, the training began immediately, and the sisters were led to a hidden underground potato shed that smelled of dirt and musty earth, where dim lantern light cast long shadows, and it was here that Franz placed a revolver into Freddie's hands for the first time, and the weapon felt alien and far too heavy for someone so young yet. When she aimed it and squeezed the trigger, light exploded in the cramped space, and the recoil rattled her arm, but her shot found the target again and again. Franz saw what even Freddie did not yet understand, that she had a steady instinct, a calmness that held even in danger, and she learned quickly how to load, unload, clean, and handle a weapon, and she learned where to set charges to collapse rail lines, and she learned how to move through streets without being noticed, though she was just 14 years old and should have been thinking about school and boys and music instead of the cold mechanics of killing. Yet the world had not given her that choice, and her first test did not involve bullets but fire, for she and Truze were assigned to burn down a Nazi storage warehouse, and the plan relied entirely on their youth and the arrogance of German soldiers. And so the sisters dressed up with makeup and carefully styled hair, and they approached the guards with shy smiles and soft laughter, playing roles they had never wanted to play, and the bored guards, eager for any distraction, never suspected a thing as they flirted with the girls, while resistance members slipped into the building unseen, and minutes later, the smell of smoke filled the air and shouts erupted as flames tore through the structure. And by the time the soldiers realized what had happened, the girls had already vanished into the night with pounding hearts and trembling hands. Yet they had succeeded, and it felt like a triumph. But triumph in war is fleeting, for fire is one thing, but taking a life face to face is something entirely different. And that darker moment came soon after, as the resistance identified a Dutch collaborator who had sent many innocent people to their deaths, and Freddie was chosen as the one who would stop him, and she rode her bicycle with the pistol hidden under a cloth, and the weight of what she must do pressed against her thoughts, and the morning felt grey and cold as she pedaled through the streets, breathing slow to steady her nerves. And she knew where the man would walk, because every detail of his routine had been studied. And when she saw him, he looked so ordinary, not like a monster, not like the kind of villain children imagine in nightmares, but like any normal man thinking about ordinary things. And that was what made her heart twist, because killing a monster is simple, but killing a person who wears the face of normal life is something that scars you deeply. Yet she did not stop pedaling, and she did not let fear freeze her. She reached into her basket, her fingers curling around the cold steel of the gun, and with steady hands born from training and terror, she rode closer, lifted the weapon, and fired the shot that shattered both the street and the last remnants of her childhood, and he fell stunned and bleeding onto the pavement, and she felt the instinct inside her scream to kneel beside him to help him rise to undo what she had done because she was still human. But she forced herself to ride away because staying meant death, and she had crossed a line that could never be walked back across. And later, that night when the adrenaline faded, she felt the crushing truth that she had taken a life, even if it was a life stained with cruelty and evil, and though she had acted for justice, it still left a wound inside her because she understood now that every act of resistance came with a piece of herself torn away, and she would have to learn how to carry that pain and still continue, for the war around her was not slowing. In fact, it was growing darker and more brutal, and the resistance needed her to become more than a courier. They needed her to become a lure one who would walk willingly into danger in order to draw out the very men who believed they were untouchable. Freddie did not know it then, but the single shot she fired from her bicycle would change more than the fate of one collaborator, because it pushed her deeper into a world where innocence had no shelter, and she would soon learn that the resistance needed more from her than quick escapes and hidden weapons. They needed someone who could walk directly toward danger with the calm of a practiced actor, and use the very thing the soldiers overlooked, her youth and her gender, as a weapon against them. For the resistance discovered that the occupying forces rarely suspected young women of being lethal threats, and the men in uniform often viewed girls as trophies or distractions rather than fighters, which created an opening that no military plan could have designed. And so Freddie and Trues stepped into a new role, one built entirely on deception, charm, and a willingness to bury their fear beneath a mask of softness. And the method was terrifyingly simple. They would enter taverns and bars where German officers drank, bragged, and tried to forget the war they were losing, and the sisters would sit alone pretending to be bored or curious or shy, and without fail, a soldier or an officer would approach and begin to speak, believing he had found an easy conquest, and the girls had to respond kindly and laugh when needed and pretend to feel safe while they listened to the drunken boasts of men who had destroyed their country. And then at exactly the right moment they would offer the invitation that sealed the officer's fate. Would you like to take a walk? And the men always agreed because they thought they were being guided toward romance, when in truth they were being guided toward their execution. And as they left the safety of the crowd and followed the girl into the dark, quiet woods, officers had no idea they were walking toward the last few minutes of their lives, and sometimes resistance fighters waited hidden among the trees ready to strike as soon as the girl gave the signal, and other times the girl herself had to perform the act alone with only her small pistol and a heart pounding hard enough to echo in her ears. And the mental toll of this work was devastating because Freddie was still just a teenager, and she had to hold the arm of a man she despised and let him walk close and speak close. And she had to pretend calm while leading him deeper where the branches formed a canopy and the soil muffled footsteps, and she knew that once the clearing was reached, she would have to turn and face him not as a girl, but as his final moment. And one mission stands out as the turning point when her transformation from frightened child to hardened fighter became absolute. For target was a high-ranking SS officer infamous for brutality, and the resistance had been hunting him for many weeks, but he was always too protected to strike openly. So the decision was made to lure him, and Freddie was chosen because no one would ever suspect a girl with a soft young face to be the one who could bring down a man feared by his own troops. And she prepared with care, fixing her hair and choosing a dress and steadying her breathing before entering the smoky tavern where he drank. And as soon as she stepped inside, he noticed her, and the arrogance in his posture showed he believed he could have whatever he desired, and he bought her a drink, and she played her role with flawless control, appearing shy yet flattered, letting him believe his charm was working. And when she suggested a walk to see the moonlight near the water, he agreed instantly, and together they stepped out into night, leaving the noise and lights behind as the darkness wrapped around them. And every step deeper into the quiet path felt like a countdown in her mind, because she knew the moment approached when she would either live or die. And she forced herself to speak casually to keep him at ease, even as she felt the weight of the pistol in her pocket. And when they reached a small clearing hidden from view, she stopped and turned to him. He moved closer, expecting a kiss, and she moved her hand to her coat and drew the weapon, and the expression on his face was one she would never forget, a look of stunned disbelief, because he had been taught that women were harmless, that girls were ornaments, and he never imagined his end would come from one, and before he could reach for his weapon or shout for help, Freddy fired, and the shot echoed like thunder between the trees, and he collapsed into the dirt, the stunned realization still on his face, and Freddy stood there trembling as the surge of adrenaline flooded her limbs, and she felt the shaking rise in her shoulders, yet she did not run right away. She stared at him, at the body of a man who moments earlier had believed himself invincible, and she let the truth settle inside her that this was the cost of resistance, and it was never clean or glorious. It was raw and personal, and it tore pieces from her every time. And later, when she returned home, her mother did not ask for details. She simply held her daughters and let them cry because she could see the 1,000-yard stare that soldiers carry after battle, and she tried to remind them that they were saving lives, not taking them without purpose, and Freddy clung to these words, yet still felt the growing weight inside her, because each mission left a deeper mark. But the war was expanding, and their duties expanded with it, and saving lives did not end with eliminating collaborators, for the sisters also became vital in smuggling Jewish children, who were marked for deportation, and this new mission would test their courage in a different yet equally terrifying way, for this time the stakes were not about striking down evil, but about protecting the innocent while walking directly past the eyes of the men who hunted them. The gun in Freddy's pocket was no longer the only tool she carried into the war, because by the time 1943 tightened its grip on the Netherlands, the German occupation had turned its full cruelty toward the Jewish families trapped within the cities and the sisters who had already taken. Lives were now asked to save lives as well, and this new part of their mission demanded a different kind of bravery, one filled not with sudden violence, but with slow, steady terror, because moving children past armed guards required nerves that never cracked and smiles that never trembled. So Freddy and Trues began working with resistance groups who specialized in rescuing Jewish children from holding centers known as creches, where they waited for deportation. And every risk, you felt like walking along the edge of a blade for any mistake. Any word spoken too loudly, any glance from a suspicious soldier could mean instant death for the child, and for the girl guiding them, and Freddy often took the smallest ones by the hand, whispering to them not to speak and assuring them softly to pretend she was their sister as they walked past checkpoints where officers scanned the streets for anyone out of place, and she would point at birds or clouds and speak in a gentle tone, so the child would appear relaxed, while inside her chest her heart pounded like a drum, because if the child cried in Yiddish or spoke one wrong word, all hope would vanish, and every step away from danger felt like a small miracle. And dozens of children were moved to safe houses in the countryside, hidden in barns under floorboards, behind false walls, in attic spaces crowded with fear. And the sisters did everything they could to shield the young from the terror of the world surrounding them. But war has no mercy. Even the bravest cannot stop fate from striking, and one afternoon, while Freddy, Trues and other resistance members were escorting children out of the city, the air raid sirens wailed from above, and the roar of Allied bombers rolled across the sky, and German anti-aircraft guns exploded with thunder that shook the streets, and shrapnel rained like metal hail. And Freddy threw herself around the children and tried to guide them to shelter, but a bomb landed too close, and the concussion hit with brutal force, and dust filled the air, and screams faded into ringing silence. And when Freddy rose from the ground, her head spinning and her breath shaking, she searched for the children she had sworn to protect. But they were gone, and death had claimed them, not by a firing squad or by the cruelty of the occupiers, but by random chance from a sky that had come to save Europe. And that day carved a scar into Freddy's heart deeper than the deaths she had caused with her own hands, because taking a life in battle was one kind of burden, but losing innocent lives while trying to save them was a wound with no way to heal. And this loss hardened her in ways she did not wish for, yet the battles ahead demanded a heart that could endure unbearable weight. And it was during these years that a third young woman entered their lives, a fierce and brilliant law student named Johanna Schaft, known widely as Hanny, and her bright red hair would become the most feared symbol of the Dutch resistance. And she quickly formed a bond with Freddy and Trues, and together they became known as three fighters who moved like shadows and struck like lightning. and their friendship was forged not through light moments, but through shared pain and shared courage and shared missions that pushed them to the edge of their humanity. And Hanny was different from the sisters in many ways, for she was older and deeply political, and she had already refused to sign the Nazi loyalty oath at her university, which cost her her education, but she did not hesitate. She stepped into resistance work with relentless purpose, and soon she joined Freddy and Trues on missions that most men refused to attempt, and they destroyed railway lines, set fire to factories, carried weapons under their coats, and executed collaborators who handed innocent people to the enemy. And Hanny's fearlessness was both an asset and a curse, because her bright hair made her recognizable across the region, and soon she became a legend whispered about by the Germans, who knew there was a red-haired girl killing officers and disrupting plans, and they placed her on their most wanted lists. Yet she did not retreat. She dyed her hair dark, but even that could not hide her burning spirit, and the three young women shared rifles, shared beds in safe houses, shared tiny portions of food when starvation swept the land, and shared every painful moment after each mission, and their bond became a lifeline in a world where each day might be their last. And as 1944 faded into 1945, the occupation turned even more vicious, and the hunger winter descended, turning the Netherlands into a frozen wasteland where people starved in the streets, and the Germans lashed out with desperate cruelty while the resistance intensified it. Sabotage and Freddy became skilled with dynamite planting charges along rail lines while lying belly down in snow so cold it froze her fingertips, and the explosions that derailed German trains sent sparks into the night sky like fiery stars. But every successful blow brought savage retaliation, and the guilt of knowing civilians might die weighed heavily on her. And yet she continued because the war demanded it, and because every act, no matter how painful, slowed the machine that had taken so many lives. And Trues carried her own memories of horror inside her, and one memory she later told revealed the darkest moment of the war for the sisters when they witnessed German soldiers seizing civilians, including a young father holding his baby, and when a frustrated SS officer tore the infant from the father's arms and brutally ended its life against a wall. Something in Trues snapped, and she stepped out with her pistol raised and shot the soldier before Freddy could stop her, and they fled through alleys as rifles fired behind them, escaping only by thin chance. And the image of that murdered baby and the rage that drove Trues' action burned itself into Freddy's mind as the truest reflection of the nightmare they lived in. And it was in these moments that she understood how war twisted every rule of humanity and forced impossible choices upon those who dared to fight back. The moment Trues fired that pistol in the street should have been the end for both sisters, because German soldiers reacted with instant shock before they gathered their senses, and the girls sprinted away from the scene with boots slamming the cobblestones behind them as gunfire snapped through the air, and they leapt fences and stumbled through narrow alleys and somehow escaped into the twisting maze of Harlem backroads. And though they lived through it, the memory of the murdered baby imprinted itself on Freddy's heart like a scar that refused to fade, and she understood then that their war was not the war told in speeches or written in clean lines on maps, but a war lived at ground level, soaked in pain, fear, and rage. And as the year 1944 turned to 1945, the danger surrounding the three young women grew even heavier because the occupation was collapsing, and Germans were panicking and tightening control as their resources dwindled, while the Dutch people sank into the agony of the hunger winter, when food vanished from cities and people dragged themselves across frozen roads, searching for scraps, and bodies lay on sidewalks because no one had strength to move them. And yet Freddy, Trues, and Hanny did not reduce their missions, they increased them, because the resistance now sought not only to kill but to cripple the German retreat by destroying transport lines and seizing stolen goods and preventing vital machinery from being taken to Germany. And this meant explosives, and explosives meant silence, precision, and the constant threat of death from even a tiny mistake. For Freddy, who had once been a shy girl, this next evolution in her role felt almost unreal, yet she adapted and soon became skilled at setting charges in the snow at night with numb hands shaking from cold as the wind cut through her clothing like blades. And one mission would forever stay in her memory, for she and Trues crawled on their stomachs along a frozen railway embankment under a sky without stars, and their breath rose in white clouds that froze before fading, and German patrols marched nearby with rifles ready, and one slip of a stone or one crunch of ice would have revealed them, yet they reached the tracks and pressed explosives beneath the rails with utmost care, taping everything with steady hands that defied the trembling in their bones. And then they crept back into the shadows and waited for the heavy German military train that carried weapons and fuel and machinery for the retreat. And when the engine approached with thunder shaking the ground, Freddy counted the seconds until the locomotive reached the trigger point, and then the world became bright, violent as the detonation lifted the rail line and shattered the train, sending metal screaming and machinery scattering across the frozen earth, and flames rising like torches into the bitter night. And for a moment the girls felt triumph because they had struck a powerful blow, yet that triumph always held a dark echo because the Germans responded to sabotage with swift brutality, dragging civilians from houses near the crash site and executing them in retaliation. And Freddy carried the guilt of this knowledge like iron in her chest, for every time she planted a charge she wondered whose life might be taken in revenge, and this moral weight gnawed at her spirit because she fought to save lives, yet her actions sometimes led to the loss of innocent ones. And she asked herself night after night whether the cost was worth it, but there was no turning back now. And as the final months of the war arrived, one name came to dominate German orders and resistance. Whispers, the girl with the red hair, for Hanny had become so notorious that even high-ranking officers feared her, and German command issued orders to capture her at all costs, and stories spread claiming that Adolf Hitler himself had been briefed about her because she represented the kind of resistance they hated most, a brilliant young woman who refused to bow to terror and who struck harder than many seasoned soldiers, and her presence became a symbol of hope to the Dutch resistance and a symbol of humiliation to occupiers. And so German intelligence agents circulated her description, and collaborators spread her name, and pressure closed in from every side, forcing Henny to dye her hair black and disguise herself with glasses. Yet even then, soldiers reported glimpses of a girl with fiery defiance in her eyes. And they doubled their search, and the three young women stayed together through these months, sharing beds in safe houses, huddling for warmth in rooms where frost crawled across the walls, eating whatever scraps could be gathered and whispering to each other through nights when hunger burned through stomachs and fear twisted through dreams. And they spoke of what they would do when the war finally ended, because hope was the only thing that kept their minds from collapsing under the weight of endless missions. And Hanny planned to return to her studies to become a lawyer who defended the powerless, and Trues dreamed of becoming an artist, and Freddy dreamed only of quiet sleep, free of the faces of the men she had killed or the children she had lost. And their bond was stronger than blood, for they had walked into death together again and again, and each time lived when by all logic they should have fallen. And they made a vow that they would survive the war together or not at all. Yet war respects no promises, and no matter how tightly they held onto each other, the world around them continued to tighten its jaws, and one day the jaws would close on one of them, and nothing the other could do would stop it, for even the strongest fighters cannot outrun fate when it finally reaches across the battlefield and chooses its victim. The final months of the war arrived like a tightening noose around every member of the resistance, and none felt that pressure more sharply than Henny, for despite her attempts to hide beneath dyed black hair and borrowed glasses, the Germans had turned her into a phantom that they hunted with desperate intensity. And the day that would seal her fate began without warning on a cold grey Tuesday, the 21st of March in the year 1945, when Hanny rode her bicycle through Harlem with a bundle of illegal communist newspapers called De Waarheid tucked into her basket and a pistol hidden beneath them. And she was not alone, for another member of the resistance rode beside her, and they moved through the streets in a way they had done countless times before. And nothing about the morning seemed unusual until they reached the Jan Jazenkade Bridge, where a German checkpoint waited. And though Hanny had passed many checkpoints safely before, this one was different because the soldiers had been ordered to perform random inspections, and the weight of fate pressed down in that single instant when a guard lifted her basket and found the forbidden papers, and then discovered the pistol. And the moment that weapon came into view, the guards seized her and dragged her away while the other rider fled, and Hanny was taken first to the local police station. and then transferred to a detention center in Amsterdam. And at first her captors believed she was simply another courier. For such arrests were common during those tense months, but time is relentless, and the black dye in her hair began to fade, and the unmistakable red roots began to appear, and when the officers saw that flash of red, they realized who she was, and their shock spread through the prison staff like wildfire, because they understood that the girl they had mocked and shoved into a cell was the very assassin who had haunted their patrols for years, and now that they had her, they would not let her go, and the interrogations began almost immediately, and though no written record describes every detail, historians know that the methods used were psychological torture, threats against her family's starvation, sleep deprivation, and relentless efforts to break her mind and force her to reveal the names of her allies, especially the two sisters who loved her like blood and whom the Germans were equally determined to capture. Yet despite the agony of her imprisonment, despite knowing her own parents were suffering in a concentration camp, Hanny stayed silent. She held her secrets behind clenched teeth and unbroken resolve, and bought her friends a little more time, even though she must have known what her silence would cost. And outside the prison walls, Freddie and Trues heard the news that Hanny had been arrested, and the world seemed to fall apart around them, for they could not imagine fighting without her, and the fear that she might reveal their names did not exist because they knew her and they knew she would endure anything to protect them. And Trues refused to accept that their friend was lost, and devised a daring plan straight out of the imagination of someone who no longer feared death, for she obtained a German nurse uniform and forged medical transport papers and marched straight to the prison where Hanny was held, and with absolute conviction she demanded to speak to the commandant, claiming she had orders to take the prisoner Hanny Shaft to another facility for a medical evaluation. And she used every ounce of her acting skill. She pleaded, she threatened, she insisted, and she stood surrounded by SS guards who would have shot her in a heartbeat if they sensed anything suspicious. And for a moment it seemed the plan might succeed because the commandant hesitated, but then he checked the logs and delivered the words that shattered Trues' heart. The prisoner Hanny Shaft had been moved. She is no longer here, and Trues knew she was lying with her face held still and her jaw locked, and she walked out of the prison knowing she would never see her friend again, and the guilt tore at her because she believed she had failed, and the days crawled forward through the final chaos of the war while Hanny remained inside the grasp of her captors. And then on the 17th day of April in the year 1945, when the German collapse was just weeks away, two officials, a Dutch collaborator named Martin Kuiper and a German executioner, removed Hanny from her cell, drove her toward the dunes of Bloemendaal near the shoreline, a place known already as a graveyard where hundreds of resistance fighters had been executed and buried in shallow sands. And as they walked her into the dunes, the wind from the North Sea whipped against her face, and she did not beg, she did not tremble, she simply stood with a dignity that unsettled even the men holding the guns, and the first shot, fired by the German officer, only grazed her head, leaving her wounded but still conscious. And she fell to her knees, yet even in that moment of mortal danger, she lifted her face, and with the last of her strength uttered the words that would echo through Dutch history. "I shoot better than you," and those words enraged the Dutch collaborator Kuiper, who stepped forward and raised his submachine gun and fired the burst that took her life, and the dunes grew silent again as her body fell into the sand. And 3 weeks later, the war ended, yet the girl with the red hair never saw freedom, and her killers buried her in a shallow grave, hoping history would forget her. But history does not forget those who stand unbroken. And while the country moved toward liberation, Freddie and Trues still clung to hope, not knowing that their dearest friend had already given her last breath for them. The officers who buried Hanny in the dunes believed that her death would vanish into the shifting sand, just as they believed that fear would swallow the spirit of the Dutch people. Yet those beliefs crumbled as quickly as their collapsing regime, because though Freddie and Trues did not yet know her fate, they felt the dread of losing her gnawing at their hearts with every hour. And when liberation finally swept across the Netherlands on the 5th of May in the year 1945, the cities burst into celebration with flags waving and voices rising in joy, and Canadian soldiers entering towns greeted by crowds who wept and embraced them and filled the streets with music and hope. Yet for Freddie the celebration felt hollow and distant, for she stood among the crowds not as a girl freed from oppression, but as a soldier battered by memories and carrying ghosts in every corner of her mind. And she watched people dance and laugh while her thoughts remained locked on Hanny, and she searched every returning prisoner wagon, every list, every rumor, hoping that her friend might still be alive and walking somewhere toward home. And for a time, Freddie and Trues held on to hope with stubborn determination, because none of them believed that Hanny could fall, not after all they had survived together. But the truth rose to the surface weeks later when mass graves were discovered in the dunes of Blomendal, and teams exhumed the bodies of 422 victims, and among them lay only one woman. And when the resistance confirmed that the lone female body was Hanny Shaft, the news tore through Freddie like a blade. And for Trues it felt like the world itself split in two, because they had fought as three, and now one part of them was gone forever. And though the war had ended for the country, it had only begun for Freddie in her mind, because she had survived missions that should have killed her dozens of times, and she had stepped through fire again and again, yet survival did not feel like victory. It felt like carrying the weight of all the dead on her shoulders. And while the world wanted to celebrate and rebuild, she found herself trapped in a silence heavier than the war itself, for no one had taught her how to stop being a soldier, and no one had prepared her for the nightmares that struck with brutal force every night, and the sudden jolts that woke her gasping as she fought enemies who no longer existed, because the horrors she had seen lived inside her thoughts like phantoms that refused to rest. And the Dutch government formed recovery programs for resistance members, and Freddie and Trues spent time at Lonersloot Palace, where Queen Wilhelmina had arranged a refuge for fighters who needed to heal. But healing did not come easily for Freddie, because she had no words to describe the things she had done, and no language to explain the sharp guilt that cut her whenever she thought of the men she had killed, or the children she could not save, or the friend had died alone in the dunes. And people around her saw only the quiet young woman who blended into crowds and rarely spoke about the war, yet inside she was breaking, and the screams that ripped through her sleep forced her to confront suffering with no cure, and without the vocabulary we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. People simply believed she had nerves or sensitivity, yet what she carried was the crushing aftermath of violence that had consumed her youth. And she tried to build a normal life, because that was what people expected, and she married an engineer named Jan Dekker, and became a mother to 3 children, and poured her heart into raising them and creating a home filled with warmth instead of fear. And she often said that motherhood rescued her, because it allowed her to bring life into a world that she had once experienced only through death and danger, and yet even happiness could not erase the scars she carried, and she lived with moments of withdrawal and long spells of grief. She never explained to anyone, and her husband did not understand why she sometimes stared into the distance for long hours with tears she refused to let fall. And while she tried to return normal life, the country she had risked everything for did not always return the favor, because Freddie and Trues had been raised in a communist household, and their politics became an uncomfortable truth during the early decades of the Cold War. And though they had fought with unrivaled bravery for Netherlands, some officials deemed their service politically inconvenient, and many recognitions were withheld for years, and the government often pushed their files aside, while medals and pensions were given freely to others. And Freddie felt this exclusion deeply, not out of hunger for fame, but because she believed the story of what they had done mattered and should not be erased, and she knew well that silence was dangerous, because silence was what allowed the occupiers to gain power in the first place. And yet the silence around her achievements lasted for decades, and she grew older while her name faded from public memory, and the narrative of the war centered on men, while women, even the ones who had killed with their own hands, were treated as if they had served only as helpers. And Freddie often said with bitterness, "Women do not count," and her words reflected a truth that wore down her spirit as she watched the world rewrite history without space for girls who had carried guns and executed missions. Most men feared to attempt, and yet she rarely spoke out, because she had never chased glory, she had chased justice. And now justice felt distant and blurred, and throughout the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, and beyond, she held her silence like a shield, while Trues became more public through her art and activism. And Freddie felt both pride and quiet jealousy, because she too had fought and survived, but chose to vanish into the background, and yet destiny would not let her story stay hidden forever, for time eventually shifted, and the country began to uncover forgotten chapters of its own resistance, and historians finally recognized that the trio of Freddie Trews and Hanny had formed one of the only fully female assassination teams in all of Europe. And once this truth resurfaced, the story of the girls with braids and red hair began awakening in the national memory again. And though recognition was still far from complete, it had begun, and the world would soon be forced to face the truth it had overlooked for 70 years. The silence that followed the war stretched across decades for Freddie because the world moved forward, but her memories refused to fade, and while she built a family and raised children, and tried to live as an ordinary woman, her past walked behind her like a shadow that stretched across every year of her life and the country she had risked her youth for was still not ready to honor women who had stepped into the darkness with loaded pistols and steady hands. And for a long time, it seemed as if history would bury her story, just as her enemies had tried to bury Hanny in the dunes, and Freddie often said with a weary voice that women did not count, and at times she believed her sacrifices would vanish without acknowledgement. Yet the passing years slowly shifted the way people viewed the resistance, and new generations of historians began searching for the truth behind forgotten missions, and uncovered the astonishing reality that Freddie Trews and Hanny had created one of the only female assassination teams in Europe. And this revelation sparked a ripple of recognition that grew until the nation itself could no longer ignore the courage of the young women who had struck fear into the occupiers and protected the oppressed. And at last, in the year 2014, the government of the Netherlands invited Freddie and Trews to a formal ceremony to receive the Mobilization War Cross, a military honor that had been denied to them for far too long, and they arrived as elderly women with white hair and fragile bodies, yet the fire inside their eyes still burned. And as Prime Minister Mark Rutte pinned the medal onto Freddie's chest, he thanked her for her bravery and her sacrifice. And the room fell silent because everyone present understood that they were witnessing a piece of living history, and for Freddie the moment felt like a long overdue lifting of a heavy weight, because the nation had finally spoken the truth she had carried alone for most of her life. And her son Remai watched with pride, knowing the world finally understood who his mother truly was. And after the ceremony, streets in Haarlem were named in honor of the sisters. Documentaries were filmed, newspapers and broadcasters retold their stories, and international reporters reached out to learn about the girl who had once ridden through occupied streets with a gun hidden beneath her schoolbooks, and the girl who had lured officers into forests, and the girl who had risked every breath to save children marked for deportation, and the girl who had survived only to carry 70 years of trauma in silence. And this renewed attention brought light back into a story that had been dimmed by politics and time, yet even recognition cannot stop the toll of age, for Trews passed away in the year 2016, leaving Freddie alone once more, and losing Trews was like losing a piece of her own soul, because no one else understood what they had endured or what they had done for their country. Freddie's health began to fade as the years crept forward, and the pain she had carried since 1940 never fully loosened its hold, and she lived her final days in a nursing home where she still spoke with sharp wit and unbroken honesty. And when a nurse asked if she felt pain, she answered with the truth she had carried for a lifetime, saying, "I have been in pain since 1940. And these words revealed the reality behind her quiet exterior, that the war had never ended in her mind, because no medal and no ceremony could erase the memories that haunted her sleep and echoed in her thoughts. And on the 5th day of September in the year 2018, one day before her 93rd birthday, Freddie Oversteegen took her final breath, and with her passing, the last survivor of the trio left the world, and an entire chapter of resistance history closed forever, because the secrets of the woods, the feeling of the pistol in her basket, the exact expressions on the faces of the men she killed, and the whispered words exchanged between the three girls in safe houses were memories she had carried alone and now belonged only to time, yet she left behind something far stronger than stories and stronger than medals. She left behind the question that had shaped her entire life, a question that echoes across history whenever darkness rises and ordinary people must choose who they will become. And the question is this: what does it mean to stay human in a world determined to crush every trace of humanity? And Freddie spent her whole life wondering if she had failed this rule, if killing had stripped her of the compassion, Her mother told her to protect, and she feared that the acts she committed to fight evil had stolen her innocence and warped her soul. But when we look back now with the clarity of history, we can see the truth she could not see in herself, because Freddy did not lose her humanity. She demonstrated it in the most painful and courageous way possible, for staying human does not mean refusing to fight, it means refusing to let fear or cruelty turn you into a bystander, and she risked her life not for glory or revenge, but to save strangers and to resist a regime built on hatred. And she carried the weight of every life she took and every life she could not save, and that burden itself proves her humanity, because monsters feel nothing, but she felt everything. And the empire she fought died long ago, its flags rotted, its ideology collapsed, and its leaders became symbols of cruelty to be condemned forever. Yet the girl with the braids, the girl on the bicycle, the girl who refused to bow to tyranny, remains a symbol of resilience and moral courage. And her story, now taught in classrooms and honored in memorials, ensures that her bravery will never fade. And when future generations wonder whether one person, especially someone young and small, can make a difference, the answer will whisper through the pages of history in the voice of Freddy. Oversteegen, a girl who once pedaled down occupied streets with a weapon hidden in her basket and changed the destiny of her nation forever. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.